Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
On the day that was supposed to be remembered as the beginning of a new chapter in my life, the world that carried my last name made a conscious decision to underline exactly where I stood in their priorities, and it was nowhere near the top. I had imagined my wedding as the kind of moment that stays stitched into the memory of a family, the type of event where you feel surrounded not only by friends, but also by those who are supposed to hold you up simply because you are theirs. Instead, my sister Kayla announced, just hours before I was to walk down the aisle, that she had organized a surprise party for her boyfriend Tyler. She pitched it as something spontaneous and romantic, the kind of impulsive grand gesture that belongs in a commercial. The problem was the timing. It was set for the exact afternoon and evening of my wedding. At first, I thought it was a tasteless joke, the sort of tone-deaf stunt Kayla had pulled before in smaller doses, like showing up to my college graduation dinner in a sequin dress that made sure no one could look anywhere else, or loudly announcing her latest dream job offer right before I cut into my birthday cake. But when the texts from my mother and father began to trickle in short, casual, and filled with excuses that had the hollow ring of rehearsed lines, I realized this wasn't just an unfortunate scheduling conflict. They were actually going. My own parents chose to attend my sister's last-minute Beer and Streamers event for her boyfriend instead of sitting in the chairs reserved in the front row of my ceremony. I remember staring at my phone in the bridal suite, still in my robe with half-finished makeup, and reading my mother's message, "We'll swing by after we show our faces, don't worry." As if swinging by a daughter's wedding after clinking plastic cups at a brewery was an acceptable substitution for being there when vows were exchanged. My father added a thumbs-up emoji, as though that little cartoon hand could fill the seat where he was supposed to stand and steady me. The coordinator came in, saw the expression on my face, and asked if I wanted to delay. I thought about it. Thought about waiting, thought about giving them the chance to choose again, but then I realized something that felt like a gut punch. People show you their choices clearly enough, and it is only pride that makes you hold the door open for them to reverse it. I told the coordinator we would start on time. When the music began and the violinist drew the first long note, my husband stood waiting with the kind of steady patience that felt like an anchor in storm waters. I walked down the aisle past friends who whispered support with their eyes. And then there were the two empty chairs in the front row, with Mom and Dad printed neatly on the place cards clipped to them. They stared back at me like unpaid debts. I said my vows, though each word carried the weight of knowing my own family had chosen to be elsewhere. When it was time to sign the marriage license, I crossed out the lines meant for my parents' names and instead asked Lydia, the caterer's mother, who had been helping bustle my dress, and Franklin, the venue manager, to witness. Both looked surprised, even moved, and signed with a gravity that acknowledged what it meant to show up when others refused. Meanwhile, Kayla was already posting stories to her feed, gold balloons spelling Tyler, a crowd chanting his name, captions that read, "Where the family actually is tonight." I saw it later, sitting in the bridal suite with my best friend handing me a cupcake I could not bring myself to bite. It was not just her selfishness, it was her mockery, her deliberate attempt to define the day not as mine, but as her stage. I made a small, sharp decision that might have looked petty from the outside, but felt necessary. I instructed the staff to box up the untouched meals from the family table and send them to the homeless shelter on Maple Avenue with a note stating they were donated in honor of my parents, who could not attend. It was my way of writing the absence into the record. The father-daughter dance was still announced. The band asked if I wanted to skip it, and I said, "Play it anyway." I danced with Lydia, who clutched my hand and whispered, "Family is who shows up." The applause roared so loud it almost drowned out the hollow echo in my chest. That night, after the sparklers faded and we drove away, I saw I had a voicemail waiting. Aunt Rosemary's voice, warm yet edged with something unspoken, filled the car. "Sweetheart, about your parents. Call me tonight. And remember what I said. Document love like you document debt." She hesitated as if there was more she wanted to say, then hung up. I opened my notebook, wrote down the exact words of the texts I'd received, printed Kayla's posts at the drugstore the next morning, and filed them away under a tab I labeled Receipts. It wasn't revenge then, it was survival, proof that I wasn't imagining what had happened. The thank you notes I mailed the next day were polite but calculated. To my parents, I wrote, "Thank you for your gift and for the lessons." Whether they thought I meant the blender or the abandonment was their problem to solve. And at dawn, my phone buzzed again with a new text from Aunt Rosemary. "Call me when you wake. I have something you need to hear." That was the moment I realized the story of my wedding wasn't an ending, it was only the opening move in a much longer game. I drove to the lake with the kind of focused calm that comes after a storm has already knocked down the weaker branches and left you with a clear view of the trunk. Because whatever came next would not be about begging people to act differently, but about deciding what to do with what they had already shown me and Aunt Rosemary, who greeted me on the dock with a towel clipped over one shoulder and a pitcher of tea sweating like it had nothing to hide, did not say, "I'm sorry," or "they didn't mean it," which would have been a soothing little lie, but instead pressed a small brass key into my palm, looped on a blue ribbon the color of honest sky, and said that this house and her kitchen and the quiet room with the quilts were mine to enter without asking, because there are times a person should not have to knock. We sat with our feet barely skimming the lake while Uncle Pete, who had the practical way of loving that shows up as replaced light bulbs and topped-off gas tanks, fiddled with the dock cleat and listened as I described the soft-bellied cruelty of being told, "We'll swing by" to a wedding, and the astonishing audacity of a sister who live-streamed the moment I would have danced with my father, while a hashtag declared where the family truly was, and did not gasp or dramatize anything, she merely reached for a notebook that looked suspiciously like mine and said that in her experience, peace requires evidence, because people who prefer a narrative will always tell you that your memory is emotional and therefore suspect, so you should record dates, quotes, screenshots, and offers made and accepted, not to build a case in court, but to build a shelter in your own head where clarity lives. They asked about the marriage that had begun under a ceiling of missing faces, and I told them that my husband and I had created a Sunday ritual that sounded silly on paper and felt like oxygen in practice, where we put our phones in the glove compartment and drove without destination, talking about money with the kind of frankness nobody in my family ever taught me. About boundaries that do not announce themselves with speeches, but arrive as simple behaviors like leaving on time and not rescuing people from consequences, and about the strange way grief can be part fury and part relief, because fury says, "I deserved better," while relief says, "I can stop asking now." Aunt poured more tea and slid an index card across the table with a phrase written in her tidy grocery list hand, a phrase she said would show up later if I needed it. 3 simple words that were private between us, and, if I chose, would be the password to any door I did not want my sister or parents to walk through, and while it felt theatrical in the moment, like we were planning a spy movie instead of a family holiday, I tucked the card into my wallet because the line between drama and strategy is often just whether you can afford the fallout. Back at home, I became a meticulous librarian of reality, which is to say I printed Kayla's caption that declared where the family actually is and circled the timestamp like a red ink teacher. Saved my mother's "so proud of you" text alongside the geotag that told on her, clipped the cousins' "wish we could have made it" next to the screenshot of the RSVP they sent 30 days earlier. And for the first time in my life, I felt the temperature in my body drop when a family thread tried to rebrand my wedding as a miscommunication. Because I no longer needed to argue or persuade, I could simply forward the exhibit and say, "This is what happened." Invitations began to arrive for the kinds of events that pretend to be olive branches while actually functioning as stage lighting for the usual star, including a girls' night that somehow cost a small fortune, a bar league softball debut for Tyler, and a Sunday brunch Riley labeled the redo, as if milestones were interchangeable like toast. I said no without apology, and, because saying no is easier when you are saying yes to something, I sent out our own invitations for a tiny backyard vow circle with aunt and uncle as our witnesses of choice, made the photo album private behind a link that required the code phrase from aunt's card, and printed holiday cards that showed the 4 of us laughing at a table groaning with simple food. A picture saturated with a kind of ordinary warmth that cannot be faked, and when Kayla messaged to ask why the link would not open and whether I had messed up the settings, I told her politely that the album was for the people who had been there when it counted, and she could see selected photos when I posted them after New Year, which she declared petty and small-minded, though it is funny how people who make you feel microscopic call you small when you stop shrinking on command. My parents tried to triangulate through concern, sending me a long note about keeping the family united and not letting one bad day define us, and although it would have been easy to respond with the screenshot of "we'll swing by," I chose a cleaner reply that thanked them for the message and confirmed we were well, because there is a difference between choosing peace and pretending amnesia, and I had no plans to participate in historical revisionism that put me in charge of their regrets. The revenge, small but exquisitely tailored, landed in mailboxes on a Monday after the first snow, when the world felt quiet and people were more likely to linger over envelopes. Inside the card, the album link sat beneath a line that read, "Enter the phrase we all shared that night," which, of course, only aunt and uncle and my husband and I actually knew, and when my mother called to say the website must be broken because it kept asking for a password and nobody told us, I said that the phrase was announced at the table and printed on the place cards, which was technically true because I printed 4 tiny cards with it and set them around the roast chicken like a charm, a detail so gentle that even I laughed at myself for the pettiness of it. Except that sometimes the most satisfying justice is the one that looks like hospitality until you notice which door stayed locked. A week later, as I was planning a modest winter weekend back at the lake to help Aunt organize the pantry and to finally label the boxes in the hall closet, my phone lit with a message that did not use emojis or sugar in either sense of the word. Just Aunt's steady tone typed into a text, "We updated our papers today. If anything happens, check the envelope under the blue mixing bowl," and although she wrote it like a housekeeping note tucked under a magnet, the words hit with the unmistakable gravity of a key dropping into your hand, which is to say I understood we had just stepped from theory into the realm of stakes. The winter was gray in the way that makes even bright houses look like they were painted with ash water, and I had just finished shoveling the shallow path outside our apartment when the call came that split the season into a before and after. Aunt Rosemary had suffered a stroke, sudden and merciless, the kind that rips away the ordinary comfort of assuming tomorrow is guaranteed. Uncle Pete, who had always moved like a man building something quietly sturdy, faltered under the weight of it, and, before spring broke the frost, he was gone as well, a man who seemed to follow his wife across every bridge they ever crossed together, including the final one. When I drove to the lake house, the silence felt heavier than the boxes piled in corners, and tucked beneath the blue mixing bowl, just as she had promised, was the envelope, sealed with her tidy handwriting that always looked like the loops of someone who believed words should stand up straight. My hands shook when I opened it, not because I expected riches, but because I suspected this was the moment she had been preparing me for when she told me to document, to preserve, to stop gaslighting myself with hope. Inside was a letter that began with "To our dearest," and as I read, the room seemed to tilt. They had left everything to me. Not a portion, not a slice negotiated with siblings, but all of it: house, accounts, the lake property, even the coin collection Uncle had curated since childhood, with a note that it was for the one who never asked, but always came. The shock of it was not just the size of the inheritance, but the clarity of the decision. They had watched my life not as background noise but as proof, and where others offered excuses, I had offered presence. I sat there for a long time at the kitchen table, the bowl still upside down on the counter, and I thought about every ride I had driven out to their place with soup or flowers. Every time I had sat on that dock while Kayla found new parties and my parents pretended distance was logistics. It felt less like winning and more like being handed the responsibility of carrying forward the love that had been consistently invested in me. My parents' reaction was something out of a poorly rehearsed play. They called, voices sharp with disbelief masquerading as sorrow, insisting that Aunt and Uncle must not have thought it through, that surely I would want to share fairly. As though fairness was abandoning your daughter on her wedding day, but expecting a paycheck of loyalty when there was money involved. Kayla, Never one to miss an opportunity to center herself, posted a thinly veiled jab on social media. Money changes people, but love never does. A caption paired with a photo of her clinking glasses at yet another party, framing herself as the steady one while casting me as greedy. I did not engage publicly, but I did choose a very deliberate act. I used part of the money to pay off my graduate loans, the ones I had labored under while my parents told me, "We can't help, you need to be independent," even as they co-signed new cars for Kayla. Then I set up a small scholarship fund at the community college, named for aunt and uncle, because if their love had been consistent, then its legacy deserved to be as well. At the ceremony unveiling the plaque, I stood before students who might one day be the kind of presence that saves someone else's sinking heart, and I smiled when I saw the empty seats reserved for founding family members that my parents never filled. They did show up afterward, though, sidling close at the reception, my mother's hand light on my sleeve, her voice pitched in that practiced tone that belongs more to theater than sincerity. "We need to talk," she said, lowering her eyes like she was about to confess something meaningful, but then she added, "About redoing your wedding properly." My father, standing just behind, chimed in with the phrase that hit like ice water, "We can fix the optics." It wasn't about regret, not about what they had taken from me on that day years ago, but about the performance, the public image, the version of history they could smile through for neighbors and colleagues. In that moment, with the scholarship banner fluttering behind me and students shaking hands with administrators in Aunt's name, I realized that my parents still thought life was a pageant where mistakes could be rebranded with the right lighting. What they hadn't accounted for was that I had learned from Rosemary and Pete how to create receipts not only of neglect but of love, how to build structures where truth stood taller than pretense. I told them calmly that we could talk soon, knowing full well that soon would arrive on my terms, not theirs. And later that night, when I sat with the scholarship papers spread out on the dining table, my phone buzzed with another message from my mother, "We'll make it perfect this time." It was the same structure as her old text, just wrapped in different clothing, and I couldn't help but think how some people never rewrite their behavior, they just rebrand it. What they didn't realize yet was that the conversation about a redo had already begun, and the stage they thought they would control was mine to design. When my parents finally asked to meet in person instead of lobbing carefully phrased messages that sounded like press releases for a brand in trouble, I chose a quiet cafe with tables spaced far enough apart that nobody could mistake eavesdropping for ambience. And I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because control wears better when it is not rushed, and I wanted time to decide exactly how much of myself I would put on the table and how much I would keep in the vault Aunt Rosemary taught me to build. They came in together, my mother with the brittle smile of someone who believes sincerity can be ironed into place with a good blazer, my father with hands shoved in his pockets like he might be searched on the way out. And after we ordered coffee, my mother leaned forward and delivered the proposal with a kind of rehearsed warmth that would have sold well in a showroom, a lavish redo of my wedding, top to bottom, the dress, the flowers, the string quartet, the guest list expanded to include their friends and neighbors because community matters, all paid for and curated by them, with Kayla as co-host to keep things fun. And yes, they said, of course they would apologize, though the apology they described sounded more like a ribbon on a box than anything that might hold weight. I listened long enough to make sure they had enough line to tangle themselves. Then I said that a redo was possible in theory, but only under a set of conditions that were not negotiable and would be written down like any contract worth signing. Conditions that were not cruel or dramatic, but plain in their purpose. Arrival 1 hour early without exception. Phones off and put away in a sealed pouch during the ceremony. No concurrent events anywhere in the county with our family name attached to them, and an understanding that this would be my day, not a neighborhood showcase or a second shot at their highlight reel. I watched their faces while I spoke, saw the flicker in my mother's eyes when I said no concurrent events, and knew at once that the old reflex to multitask love had not been retired so much as rebranded. They agreed quickly, too quickly, with that overeager nod people give when they intend to renegotiate the moment your back is turned. And within a week an email from my father arrived bearing a spreadsheet that would have been impressive if it had not made me feel like a caterer reading someone else's vision board. Venues that felt like corporate lobbies with chandeliers, a guest list swollen with must-invite colleagues, and a timeline that slotted me in between welcome cocktails and a surprise toast for Kayla and Tyler at a trendy brewery down the road, labeled very short, will not overlap. Which was the kind of phrase that sounds harmless until you map it against experience and realize that overlap is not measured in minutes, but in attention, and once attention splits, the daughter always loses the coin toss. So I said yes to a rehearsal, but I located it in the one place that did not budge for pretense, the community college auditorium newly named for Aunt Rosemary and Uncle Pete, a bright, dignified room where students stood up and practiced arguments that would change their lives, and I told my parents, in writing, the exact hour to arrive, the simple dress code, the fact that one row at the front would be reserved for them, and that the only photographs allowed would be taken by the hired shooter, whose instructions came from me. It felt like planning a fire drill in a building with a history of ignoring alarms, and I went to bed the night before with the practiced calm of someone who knows where the exits are. They texted at first with sunny reassurance, leaving now, on our way, traffic should be fine, the familiar chorus they used like cologne, and then, 15 minutes before call time, another message arrived that might as well have been a rerun. They were going to stop by the brewery for a 2-minute engagement toast, a promise so obviously false that I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only way to keep your blood from boiling over into something messier, and I replied with the clarity of a manager closing a till. The rehearsal would begin exactly on schedule whether or not they were seated. We started with the lights up just enough to make every chair look like a decision, and when the pianist played the stripped-down processional I had chosen, my husband took my hand and we walked the line we would have walked years ago if respect had not called in sick. And I spoke, not a vow, but a simple welcome to the handful of people who had shown up, and I dedicated the rehearsal to the students whose scholarships carried aunt and uncle's names, because this room was theirs before it was mine, and I wanted the heir to remember it. The photographer caught the frame I wanted without my needing to describe it. 2 programs clipped to 2 empty chairs in the front row, each with my parents' names printed in a font that refused to apologize. The stage lights striking the paper just enough to make absence visible without theatrics, and after the last note faded, I posted a single photo with a caption that said nothing more than rehearsal, on time, a line so gentle it could not be called an attack, and yet so precise that anyone who had followed our story felt the blade. The revenge was not loud, but it was calibrated, because I did not accuse them of anything. I merely documented the weather and let people bring umbrellas or not, and when my mother called demanding I take the photo down because it was unfair and people will get the wrong idea, I told her kindly that ideas tend to sort themselves when timelines are clear, and that if she wanted a different picture next time, arriving early was shockingly effective. The cliff edge revealed itself not 5 minutes later when Kayla's name flashed on my screen, her voice already climbing as she launched into a frantic tangle about the brewery, the toast, the tags, and how I was ruining the engagement. And then she said the thing that turned the air electric, "Take it down now, or I swear I will go public with what Aunt told you," which stopped me cold because it was the first time she admitted there was something to tell at all. The night after Kayla's threat, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, listening to its uneven rhythm, and I kept replaying her words about going public with what Aunt told you. It was the first time she had admitted that something had been spoken in confidence between Rosemary and me, something she wasn't supposed to know, which meant my parents had been whispering in circles behind my back, trying to pry open a vault that only I held the key to. For days I let the tension build, answering their calls with measured silence, sending short replies that revealed nothing, because power sometimes grows not from what you reveal, but from what you refuse to say. They wanted me cornered, desperate for a truce, but I wanted them restless, pacing the edges of a story they couldn't narrate without me. Eventually, the demand arrived dressed as generosity, a proposal for a full redo at the lake house, the family showpiece, with vows, photographers, a banquet. Even a choreographed father-daughter dance that they believed would erase the image of those two empty chairs that had become their ghost. They offered to cover everything, to invite everyone, to stage manage an event so polished that nobody would ever remember the original fracture. It was not a redo for me, it was an absolution for them, and I could see the hunger in their eyes when they spoke about it, as though rewriting history on camera would let them edit out the guilt they never admitted in words. I agreed, but not with the obedience they expected. I told them that if we were to gather, it would not be a wedding but a dinner, a listening dinner, where each participant would take the microphone in turn and speak without interruption. Their words recorded and preserved so that no one could later twist them into different shapes. They thought I was joking until the night arrived and they walked into the transformed dining room at the lake house. The long table gleamed under soft lights, but instead of place cards with floral patterns there were printed transcripts of old texts, screenshots of Kayla's posts, and copies of the message my parents had sent on my wedding day with the phrase, "We'll swing by." At the head of the table sat the projector, humming, ready to throw their words in bold letters across the wall. My mother paled when she saw it, my father muttered that it was unnecessary, and Kayla hissed that I was cruel. But I simply lifted the microphone and began by reading my vows aloud, not the ones from years ago, but a new version. One that promised I would never again let people define love by convenience. Then I turned the mic over and invited them to speak. They shuffled, stammered, protested, but under the weight of their own documented history, the room felt less like a celebration and more like a trial where silence condemned as loudly as confession. When my father tried to change the subject to optics, I stopped him and offered them the only deal that mattered. If they wanted redemption, it would not come from a staged redo of a wedding they once chose to skip, but from funding a living memorial in aunt and uncle's names, a community garden for families who needed fresh food, and an emergency fund for students one crisis away from dropping out. If they signed the check, their names would appear quietly at the bottom of the plaque, not above it, and they could sit in the front row of a vow renewal at sunrise, where the only invited guests would be the scholarship recipients whose futures were already being shaped by aunt and uncle's legacy. They balked, they argued, but the alternative was clear: remain trapped in their own absence, remembered forever as the parents whose chairs were empty. Kayla sputtered threats, claiming she would reveal aunt's secret, but I only smiled and told her that truth carries its own timetable, and perhaps one day I would tell it myself, or perhaps I already had. And they simply hadn't recognized it in the choices aunt made. The ambiguity burned in their faces, because uncertainty is a punishment that lingers longer than exposure. At dawn, the garden still damp with dew, my husband and I stood with a small circle of students, hands linked, voices quiet, the air filled with the kind of sincerity that doesn't need chandeliers. 2 chairs at the front were reserved, programs clipped to them, just as before. I heard the crunch of gravel in the distance, the hurried footsteps of my parents, their voices carrying in the morning air, "We're on our way." The exact words they had sent on my wedding day. I looked at the empty chairs, felt the weight of years pressing against the present, and realized that closure is not an event but a decision. Whether I allowed them to sit, whether I kept the chairs empty, whether I let history repeat or forced it to freeze in its own reflection, those choices were mine alone. The students began to sing softly, a simple hymn Rosemary loved, and the first rays of light broke over the horizon. I glanced once more at the 2 chairs, then lifted my face toward the sun, leaving the question unanswered for everyone but myself. The screen of memory cut to black, and in that silence, the truth about who finally showed up and who never did remained suspended like a story no one else would ever fully own.